Here's a real environmental success story. The ozone layer is repairing itself. Hi there, everyone. I'm Jeff, and this is Plain English, where we help English learners around the world. And it really is around the world. It's like 160 countries where we have listeners. We help you upgrade your English skills with current events, trending topics, and common English expressions. Today is lesson number 564. So if this is your first time listening, you are in for a treat. There are 563 other plain English lessons that you can listen to, but this one is already online at plainenglish.com/564. JR is the producer. He's the one that uploads all the great content to the website for you each and every Monday and Thursday. Coming up today, the ozone layer is on track to be completely repaired by the 2060s, according to a report earlier this year by the United Nations. When I was a kid, the ozone layer was the number one environmental topic of the day, and a remarkable worldwide effort to slow the damage to the ozone layer has been successful, at least according to the latest modeling. In the second half of today's lesson, I'll show you how to use the English phrasal verb thin out. This is a hard one, so pay close attention during the lesson to see if you can understand the meaning. Let's dive in. Ultraviolet B rays, or UVB rays, from the sun cause sunburns and cancer in humans and can kill plant and animal life. Luckily, the Earth's atmosphere deflects the majority of the sun's UVB rays, and the sun's rays don't harm us as long as we don't stay in the sun for too long. But for a time in the 1980s and 1990s, it appeared that the part of the atmosphere that protects us from the sun was depleting at an alarming pace. Scientists warned at the time that it could be gone entirely by the 2060s. That part of the atmosphere is called the ozone layer. It's between 15 and 50 kilometers above the Earth's surface. The oxygen you breathe is O2, two atoms of oxygen bound together. Ozone is just a little different. It's O3. Scientists have monitored the ozone layer for a long time, and in the early 1980s, they discovered that the ozone in the stratosphere was thinning out over the poles, Antarctica, and the Arctic Circle. They also knew the culprit, industrial chemicals called chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs. These were common in refrigerators, industrial processes, and aerosol sprays. CFCs contain chlorine, and what happened was this. The CFCs released near the Earth's surface eventually rose into the stratosphere. Once there, the chlorine in CFCs reacted with the ozone. In this reaction, the O3 ozone broke apart. One chlorine atom fused with one oxygen atom, forming chlorine monoxide. And the remaining 2 oxygen atoms formed O2, the oxygen we breathe. So the more CFCs that were released into the atmosphere, the more the O3 ozone broke apart. But that's not all. Remember that chlorine from CFCs reacted with the O3 to become chlorine monoxide. Well, eventually, guess what? The chlorine monoxide broke apart, freeing that same chlorine atom to react with even more ozone and repeat the process. And then something happened that seems impossible today. Almost the whole world got together to solve the problem. In 1986, the United Nations began work on an international treaty that would ban CFCs. The treaty eventually became the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer. That's a mouthful, so we'll call it the Montreal Protocol. 197 countries signed the international treaty, which identified over 100 substances that would be banned. They included Freon, which was the chemical that made your refrigerator work. Freon was also found in dehumidifiers, ice machines, water coolers, and vehicles. That's not all. A lot of aerosol sprays, like hairspray and deodorant, had CFCs. So did insulation, packing material, and fire extinguishers. Transitioning away from CFCs was a costly and long process, but the Montreal Protocol included assistance for developing countries. The treaty recognized that stopping the release of CFCs was a global responsibility, but it would be harder for poorer countries to make that transition. So the treaty provided economic assistance to developing countries to make the transition. Fortunately, there were already alternatives to almost all CFCs. It wasn't a question of giving up products or technologies, but rather of making them in new, albeit more expensive ways. Freon, for example, was the CFC used in refrigerators and air conditioners. New machines were made with Puron, a hydrocarbon refrigerant that doesn't contain chlorine. But that didn't mean that CFCs were phased out overnight. The average life of a refrigerator, of a truck, of an ice maker could be decades. So while new refrigerators were made with Puron, the old Freon machines were still in use. Even today, some old machines still use Freon. The good news, though, is that a new United Nations report shows that the ozone layer is repairing itself. The study showed that the ozone layer will be fully recovered in 4 decades from now, by the 2060s. It said that the global average will return to its 1980 state by the year 2040, and that the ozone layers by the poles will recover by 2066. This is a success. The Montreal Protocol is often considered the most effective international treaty ever signed. One estimate says that the world's action in Montreal will save 500 million cases of skin cancer. Another says that worldwide warming would have been 1 degree Celsius higher by 2050 without Montreal. I mentioned last week that we refreshed our Instagram account. I'd love to see you on there on Instagram if you're on that platform. Follow us at Plain English Pod and we'll brighten up your feed. If you use Instagram for English learning, you can favorite posts that you want to review later. Some of our posts are about the expressions we talk about here. So if you hear one and you need a reminder or you want to practice it later, just click the bookmark icon and you'll be able to go back and look at it later. That works for other accounts too, not just for Plain English. So if you follow English learning accounts, just click that bookmark for posts that you want to review later. At Plain English Pod is how you'll find us on Instagram, and I check all the messages too every day, so feel free to tag us on your posts or send a DM. The English expression we'll talk about today is thin out. This is a phrasal verb, and this is hard to explain. I'm going to try my best, so here we go. You know the word thin, right? It's the opposite of thick. There's thick and there's thin. Sometimes you take something that's thick and you want to make it thin. And when you do that, you thin it out. But wait, you can't just use this for making anything thin. For example, if you lose weight, if you lose body fat, you don't say thin out, you just say get thinner. So when do you use thin out? You use thin out when you remove the component parts so that there are fewer parts covering the same area. Fewer parts covering the same area. So the easiest way to think about this is in forestry. Imagine you have a dense forest. There are lots and lots of trees, and it's very thick. But a dense forest doesn't allow all trees to grow in the healthiest way. So in forestry, it's sometimes necessary to thin out the forest. To thin out the forest means you go into the forest and you cut down some trees evenly so that the forest covers the same area, but it's not as dense. There are not as many trees, but the forest covers the same area. Now notice, this is not the same thing as cutting down all trees in one part of the forest. This is about cutting down some trees over the whole area. So the forest covers the same area, but there are fewer trees in it. That's thin out. At my barber shop, the barber cuts my hair, and then he takes a special kind of scissors to thin out my hair. I like this in the summertime. My barber uses this scissor on my whole head, but it only cuts a little of the hair that it touches. So my head is still covered in hair, but there's less of it. It's less dense, less thick, because these scissors thin it out. Now, some people's hair might thin out involuntarily. Some people lose all the hair in one region. That's called a bald spot. Other people, they might lose hair starting on the forehead and working backward. That's called a receding hairline. But other people keep their hair on their whole head, but it just gets thinner and thinner over the years. For them, their hair is thinning out. There's less volume, less material, but it covers the same area. Did I manage to offend anyone? I hope not. Now to the ozone layer. When I was a kid, they kept talking about the hole in the ozone layer. And it made you think there was a hole, like a big area where there was no ozone. Well, that wasn't exactly right. There were areas where the ozone was much thinner. The whole globe was covered in ozone up there. There was no hole. But the ozone was thinning out over the poles. So ozone still covered Antarctica. It still covered the Arctic Circle. But the ozone layer there was thinner. It became less dense. So think back to the dense forest where they cut down trees in the interior to make it less dense. Well, instead of trees, these were the O3 molecules that were being dismantled when they reacted with the chlorine in CFCs. The ozone layer was thinning out over the poles. Here's another way to use it. The crowd is starting to thin out. If you go to a crowded concert or a crowded bar, there are a lot of people packed into the whole space. The whole space is full, and people are pushing up next to each other. You can barely move. But then, as the night goes on, some people start to leave. And what happens? The whole space is still full of people, but now everyone has a little more breathing room. There's a little more space in between every person, so the crowd is starting to thin out. Here's a quote from Mark Twain, a writer. He said, "Everyone is a moon and has a dark side which he never shows to anybody." I saw that written on the wall of the metro here in Mexico City, and I stopped and took a picture of it because I wanted to use it for the quote of the week. Everyone is a moon and has a dark side which he never shows to anybody, said Mark Twain. Well, that is all for today's Plain English. Congratulations on making it to the end, and congratulations on all the great progress you are making in English. If you would like to help us reach even more people, then come join us on Instagram. Leave your likes, leave your comments, tag us in your stories. We're really making an effort to make our Instagram account useful to you, yes, but also to help other people discover plain English through social media. So I would love as many of you to connect with us on Instagram at Plain English Pod. And if you do, and if you like what we post, then we'll continue to put more great English learning content up there. Instagram at Plain English Pod. Coming up on Thursday, we'll revisit some recent lesson topics that have been in the news lately. See you then.